Today, as we are looking at Luke, we're in chapter 8, and we will be reading the first 3 verses, and then we're going to be jumping all the way to verse 40. There's a theme in chapter 8 that we want to hear, and the first verses and then the latter verses, they come together and will help us see that theme. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Now, verse 40. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, and they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. But when they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding around and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." There is no one story that can define a country. There just isn't one. And so while it's true that we do live in this awesome country of opportunity, and the world continues to describe that, I don't think that I could explain a single story that would wrap up everything that is involved in this great country that we call America, even if you chose a great story. Now, just because of how we are today with all of our news, we end up becoming familiar with certain names. And in our day and age today, we're kind of familiar with who are the richest and most famous people in the nation today. And if I was to choose one of those people who had an awesome story, the guy at the bottom there, Mr. Warren Buffett, if we were to cover his story, well, it would be interesting. 1930 he was born, Omaha, Nebraska. He says that his life began to change at age 7 when he read this book, 1,000 Ways to Make $1,000, and he figured out he could put that in practice. And so at age 7, he started off immediately, and he was out there selling gum, and he moved from selling gum to selling newspapers, and by the time he was 16, he had already made enough money that he was ready to launch his first company. And so at 16, Warren Buffett launched the Warren Buffett's used golf balls business. And he found himself to be a pretty good business person. And so he went from one business to another business. And by the age of 32, this guy is already a millionaire. By the age of 60, he is a billionaire. And by the age of 78, Forbes lists him as the richest person in the entire country. And if you want to talk about a story that talks about the land of opportunity, well, it seems like the story of Mr. Buffett is a pretty good one to refer to. But if I was to tell my friends over in Romania and Moldova that story, would they really understand what's involved in this country of great opportunity called America? No, they wouldn't. You see, I could tell them a small story, but that small story takes place in the context of a much greater story. Because you see, Warren Buffett was operating in a country that had economic stability. He was operating in a country that is not influenced by a caste system, by a feudal system, and not by a system of warlords. And in that context, things can happen, and if you don't grasp the whole context, you'll never grasp what's going on in the story of Warren Buffett. There is no country that can be defined by a single story. And that leads us to a principle, and the principle is this: we don't get the full picture from just one story. And here's why we're going to talk about that. Because as we study Luke, you've been noticing we've been studying it one story at a time. And as we study it one story at a time, we could miss some of the grand themes that Luke is telling us because we're just focusing on each particular story. And it would be tragic for us to miss some of those grand themes. Today we will not pass up on one grand theme because chapter 8 is rich in that grand theme. And the grand theme that we find in Luke is this, that God is using women in his kingdom to transform lives. They are heavy hitter players, and Luke emphasizes this in a way that was shocking for his day and age. You roll back history, and you know what it was like. Men got most of the press in history in the past. They got the good press and the bad press. So the worst villains in history, they're the men. And as we look back historically and we count all the heroes, well, most of them seem to be men. But you know, Luke breaks out of that mold. And he says, I'm going to write about women more than other writers in my day because I'm writing about a different kingdom. And in this kingdom, women are going to play an extraordinary role. And Luke bucks the trend to teach us the truth that in this kingdom, God is working through women. Now, we saw that theme 2 weeks ago when we were looking at Luke describe a situation. Jesus walked into a room. Simon the Pharisee was the master of ceremonies. There's a woman who entered the scene. She washes Jesus' feet. By the time you finished that story, did anyone here want to be like Simon? Nope. Did anyone here want to be like the woman? Yep. Do you know how often that happens in the Gospel of Luke? It happens all the time, and what we notice is that while Simon is misbehaving badly, the woman was acting splendidly, and Luke does this time and time again to teach us something that society was overlooking. And as we find ourselves in chapter 8 today, this is how Luke begins to introduce it. Now, after this, Jesus was traveling from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. Remember, that is what Jesus must do, and he will not stop talking about this kingdom. So he's going about talking about this kingdom. Now, look at this. And then the 12 were with him, and some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, and he begins to name them. And right there in chapter 8, right at the very beginning, we are seeing that all of this is taking place, that women have a key role, because that is how God designs his kingdom, and Luke will not bypass this emphasis. And right there in verse 2, we find an extremely unexpected combination. When we bump into an unexpected combination, it sort of just grabs our attention. So here's an individual who created an unexpected combination. He thought that he could take his riding lawnmower and he could use it in order to trim his hedges. That is an unexpected combination, one that I would not recommend us try. Very dangerous. I remember coming back from overseas, and as I was just going about my normal routine, making it to a fast food restaurant, I bumped into an unexpected combination. Never thought you could order one of these. Do you remember the day that you could order a bacon sundae? Yes, right here on our own country. They were putting bacon and ice cream together. To me, that was a very unexpected combination, and I wouldn't have even tried it if my nephew had not goaded me for the third time. That's what it took, an unexpected combination. But in our text today in verse 2, we find a combination that is less expected than ice cream and bacon together. This is what Luke writes. Consider this. He says, and then Jesus was with the 12, and they were with women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Did you just see that combination? Here is a holy rabbi teaching us how we pursue God. He has his faithful followers, and right beside his faithful followers are a group of women who have recently been possessed by demons. By the way, Mary Magdalene, she had 7 of them. Wow, what a combination. And I am positive that as Luke wrote that line, he had a smile on his face because everybody was going to be surprised. And Jesus' enemies, they would take that text and they would say, look at this. You see, Jesus, he just makes mistakes because look who he puts together. But you and I, we don't read the text that way. Why do we read the text differently? We go, I'm not surprised. And the reason why we're not surprised to see his disciples together with women who recently had evil spirits is this. Jesus just told us a parable in which everybody's a debtor and no one can pay their debts. It's the grand equalizer in life. And we all have to come to Jesus, and we all have to be forgiven by grace. And as soon as that happens, well, it doesn't really matter what your past is. And these women are doing something that's very important. They're making a contribution. And it seems that they heard Jesus teach the kingdom of God, and it seems like their lives were transformed by that message. And because they were transformed by that message, they started to back the effort. And Luke says, what was going on in part because these women were making it happen. Now, I just want to state the obvious. There is no gospel writer who referred to the men who were sponsoring and supporting the ministry of Jesus. No gospel writer. If there were men doing that, they are not mentioned. But God does mention the women because he wants us to know that they are playing a big role in this kingdom. And God is working through them in order that people will be changed and transformed. You see, one of the themes in the Gospel of Luke is this, is God is working in and through women to establish his glorious kingdom. And as we read Luke, it just begs that we recognize this. Luke wrote a lot about women. And I'm so glad he did, because it opens my eyes and your eyes. And here's what I say. Here in Du Bois and in the Tri-County area, it begs recognition for us to stop and say, we see it too. Do you not see it at this church? Here's what I see at this church. I see women who are demonstrating the love of God, the wisdom of God, and the graciousness of God, and they are demonstrating through their lives who Jesus is and how Jesus transforms. And we are part of this story of God using women all around the world so that we would understand his kingdom well. It is going on right now in this generation. And I want to thank the women of this church. He is working in us, and it is powerful. This is the grand story that is in Luke, and Luke will substantiate this story by talking about a precise story. And Jesus was on his way. The crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. No one could heal her. 12 years is a long time to be suffering. And she was suffering in multiple ways simultaneous. I wonder if you think about a time in your life that you were out of place, outclassed, and overwhelmed, what comes to your mind? I have so many moments in my life when I was out of place, outclassed, and overwhelmed. I remember an occasion in which for 3 days I actually found myself with a semi-professional basketball team from the United States traveling in Europe. And that meant that I was walking around with these huge guys of 6'8", 6'10", 6'11", and the guys who were a little bit shorter than that, you took one look at them and you realized they can run up and down the court all day long, slice to the basket. And around those people, I felt like a slug. And do you know none of those guys came up to me and said, "Hey, Dave, do you play basketball too?" They didn't ask. You know why they didn't ask? They took one look at me and they went, No, he doesn't play basketball the way that I do. And you know what I didn't do with those guys? I didn't say, "Hey, I play basketball too," because their version of basketball and my version of basketball are two totally different games. I felt totally outclassed when I was in their presence. There was another occasion in which a whole group of university professors paid a visit to my town, and I took them on a city tour. Have you ever spent time surrounded by the super intelligent? Tell you what, I felt so overwhelmed when I was with them. I had been living in that city for more than 10 years. I was trying to explain my city to them, and as I was talking, professors constantly cut in and were explaining things about my city that I had never heard of. They knew more about my history, about my culture, about my architecture, about my art than I did, and I found myself to be rather overwhelmed in their presence, feeling like I didn't measure up. Finally, I remember a very odd occasion in which I was invited to an interesting banquet. I was not the typical person at the banquet. The people who had been invited to the banquet, the vast majority of them were there for one reason. Consider this. They had each dedicated themselves to giving $1 million away to missions. And that's why they were part of the banquet. That is $1 million of personal money. Now, I don't know about you, but when I do the math about what my income is, and when I think about the likelihood of me giving away $1 million to missions, the math is not in my favor. And so I was sitting at this table, and around the table, here's a guy who owns a business as an entrepreneur. Here's a guy who has 350 employees. Here's a person who flew there in their private jet, and I'm supposed to have casual conversation with the people at the table. I mean, do you know how I felt? Hey, how's business going, guys? I mean, I just felt so inferior in their presence, not because they wanted me to feel inferior, because I had that stuck in my head. Now, you take all three of those situations, and you wrap them all together, and you would not experience 1/10 of what that woman was experiencing for the last 12 years of her life. And here's why. For 12 years of her life, she had an illness which made her ceremonially unclean to all of the Jewish people. For 12 years, she had not been invited into the courts of the temple. For 12 years, if she touched anyone, they would not be invited for several days to enter into the courts of the temple. And so she found herself to be viewed by all other people as being unclean. And so she was constantly surrounded by people who looked holier than she was, more acceptable than she was, and she was completely marginalized. Do you know how society treated her? They treated her the same way we would treat somebody who stands up in the middle of Walmart and says, I have the coronavirus. That is how everybody was treating her. They were keeping maximum distance. This woman had been living in a very, very dark place for a very long time. But the interesting thing is we bump into her on a day that she has a ray of hope come into her life. Now, where does the ray of hope come from? Well, remember what we just read in chapter 8, verse 2? Jesus and the disciples were traveling with women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Did you just hear that? The marginalized in society had already been touched by the life of Jesus, and they had already found healing. And so in her mind, she's like, hey, something new is going on here. The sick and the possessed, they're being cured. Maybe, just maybe, I might have my opportunity as well. And she started to have in her heart hope that was growing. And she had a plan. Now, her plan was interesting. Consider her plan. If I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'm not going to look him in the eye. I'm not going to introduce myself to him. I'm not even going to be recognized. I'm just going to sneak in a clandestine manner. I'm going to touch him, and I'm going to get out of there. And I think that in that situation, he can heal me. That was her plan. Now think about that plan. Her plan is that I think that my body can be transformed, but there was one part of her that she wasn't planning on being transformed. You see, she saw herself as an inferior person, and as an inferior person, she was going to sneak in to get healing, and as an inferior person, she was planning on sneaking back out without anyone ever knowing. Now, why wouldn't she just stand up and go, woohoo, I'm healed? Why wouldn't she look people in the eye and say that's true? Because everything that she had heard about herself for 12 years is, you are not what you should be. And so she thought that she could come to Jesus and have her body transformed, but her ransacked soul under the burden of inferiority, she could not imagine that would be changed. That was her plan. And the interesting thing is that her plan worked. She reaches out and she touches the hem of his garment. And her own confession in the text is this, and I was instantly healed. I mean, she has what she wants. She is going to head home because her mission is accomplished, But Jesus' mission for her is not finished. And he will not let her sneak back home as an inferior person. And so he says the words that she does not want him to say, "Who touched me?" Oh, she didn't want to hear those words. And Jesus insisted. He insisted until she had to come forward. And as she comes forward, and now every eye is on her, consider what he does. He says publicly, for everyone to hear, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. You are restored physically, and you are restored here in the eyes of the community before us." Is that not glorious what Jesus did? Because in that moment, the invisible and the miserable becomes the accepted and the admired. And we greatly admire the faith of that woman today. Here's what we learn about our Jesus, is that he plans on delivering comprehensive healing, healing that was more than what she even had in her mind. That is the goodness of our Jesus. And as we look at that woman, we learn this, that the touch of faith is no mere touch. Now, Luke made this pretty clear so we didn't miss the point. He said, and at that time, Jesus was about being crushed by the crowd. I mean, in this crowd, you get jostled and nudged, and everybody's touching everyone. This is a pandemic nightmare going on right here. And Jesus is being touched by absolutely every person, and in that context, he asks, "Who touched me?" To which Peter said, "Everybody touched you." But Jesus said, no, there's a special person. She started in the back of the crowd. She worked her way forward, trying to approach in a ghost-like fashion so that no one would see. And her touch was different because she came and she touched with faith. And that is why we admire her today, because of her faith. Scour this text as much as you can to find why her faith was special. You're going to see that there's no paragraph that describes her faith. It's not diagnosed. It's not broken down into the little components. There's just one thing that's clear. Her faith was in Jesus. It was in nothing else. It was in Jesus. And this is what Jesus says: when you put your faith in me, that is a game changer. Jesus will repeat that idea just 2 verses later in verse 50. He goes off to Jairus' home. There's a girl who's died. And he looks at the people and he says, "Only believe." This is all about faith. Put your faith in me. And when we put our faith in Jesus, that changes everything, because he is worthy of our faith. So we have spent some time now looking at the smaller story of a woman that is taking place in the broader story of God working through women. And that is a story that continues to this day. I'm going to ask for Kristen to come up and join me. And Kristen, I'm so glad that we have this really cool thing, like we're part of the same kingdom, and that's beautiful. And so God's working through us. He's working through you. And I think that God kind of put a dream on your heart one day. Would you tell us about that dream?
Yeah. So my whole entire life, I always wanted to work with children, and I wanted to help people, whether it was children, men, it was women. So about 3 years ago, this past January, I was asked to be the director of God's Little Treasures. So I've been the director of God's Little Treasures here at Treasure Lake Church for 3 years. And it's been a great time for me, just with working with the children, helping the children. But it also has opened a door for me to help women in the moms of God's Little Treasures. So within the first year and a half of my career at God's Little Treasures, there was a mom that would come in and out and drop her children off, and I've noticed she was going on a downhill. Something was wrong with her. So I had pulled her aside, and I took her into the break room, and I asked her, hey, like, what's going on? Like, something's wrong with you. What's going on? And she just started break down crying. She had a drug problem, pill problem. She lost everything. She's been lying her whole entire life. So I prayed with her, and I actually took her to Pastor Dick because, I wasn't a pastor. So I gave her to Pastor Dick. And then after that, things went downhill from there for her. She lost everything, lost her two children. They were obviously pulled out of our childcare. So after that, I didn't hear from her for a long, long time. So I had prayed to God, like, what do you want me to do? Like, I feel like I'm being pulled into a ministry where I see women that are struggling with a lot of stuff. So then after that prayer, I started getting several other moms into my office that dealt with depression, suicide, marriage problems. I mean, their whole life was laid out in front of me. And to this day, they still come. And I have 22 staff as well, and they come and lay out their stuff that's going on. Because we are all a hot mess. Like, all of us, we're a hot mess. We have all of our problems. We're just a hot mess. So there's no judgment from me, and I think they feel comfortable. So that led me and Miss Ashley, who's the assistant director. She's back there. We had talked with Miss Brittany, and we decided to do a Bible study. And so when Pastor Dave and Sherry came along, we decided to start a Bible study every Saturday at Aegis Coffee House from 9:30 to 11:30. And we have 15 moms from God's Little Treasures that come, and they learn about Jesus. They learn about being vulnerable. They have laid out everything to us, all that kind of stuff. So within that time frame, another mom came to me, and she said, hey, I would really like to join Bible studies here at, the church. Where do I go? So I was helping her to go do that. And then she was another mom that was struggling with a lot of issues. And we actually helped her to get through that. She started going to our Bible study. And then one day after our study, she pulled me aside. And she's like, I have to ask you a question. And I said, what? She goes, you look like you have it all together all the time. And I just dead stared at her. And I was like, no. I was like, A, I'm a hot mess. B, I yell at my children. I yell at my husband. My family back there can, vouch for that. I lose it all the time. I said, I'm late for everything. I said, I'm not, by the God's grace and his faith has brought me to where I am. And one day I just prayed as I was working, I was like, Lord, why did you bring me these women? What is going on? And here he told me, you had suffered through a bunch of stuff in the past. Again, I'm a hot mess as well. I'm not perfect. And he said, I'm using you to help all of these women. And so as I stopped and thought about that, every single one of these women has suffered from something that I have suffered from, or I continue to suffer from. So as a community, we still are reaching out to women. It's just not God's Little Treasures Bible study. We want to reach out to the community, and we want to make it grow because we are women that need to rely on women. So God put that dream into my heart, and it is coming true.
Such a beautiful thing to see God's kingdom at work. We would expect this. And the truth is, if we had time for person after person to come up here and say, I see God working through me, the stories would go on and on. Because this is his plan, that he would work through each and every one of us. There's one other person who wanted to share some words. He's going to share some words with us through a different mechanism. Let's listen to Tyler.
Hi, my name's Tyler Miles. I was born and raised here in DuBois, Pennsylvania. You could say that in high school and college, friends and family wouldn't consider me a person of faith. But right now I'm sitting here to tell you that I am now to this day, and I just want to tell you why. So three things that Brittany has really been that person for me. First one is that she invited me to the Treasure Lake Church. Second would be that she really hit a nail on the head as far as letting me know that when it comes to church, it's not so much based on religion or anything, but that it's centered on a relationship with Christ. And third, it would be that if I have any questions or anything, that she is the person that God put in my life that I can go to for answers. in order to grow, everyone needs a certain someone to help them along the way. And that person that God sent would happen to be Brittany.
And God sends people to each one of us. This opportunity to say, Jesus, use me. And he says, I am on it. I have planned it. I have intended it before the foundation of the earth, that his kingdom would grow and expand through us.